Water level monitoring, what is it and why do I care? Okay. Back in November, I put out this latest, greatest 2022 update of the daily hydrograph maps. Some of you have seen this. I don't know if all of you have, but some years will go by and I make this map and I don't know that anyone even sees it. So I thought, and Celine agreed, that it might be a good idea that I kind of go over what monitoring is all about and what we use the results for. So that's what this is about. Okay, back in the day, the way we used to measure water levels is we used what was called a steel tape. Amazingly, that's a steel tape measure on a reel. And it's like a dipstick, except it has markings for feet on it. And you would reel that down into the well until you got below the depth of the water. And then you'd pull it back up, kind of like a dipstick in a car, and you'd be able to see where the water level was. And you'd subtract that number from the number at the very top of the well, and you'd say, okay, the water is this far down. And if you were kind of an amateur, not a pro, you would get a piece of chalk like they used to have back in the day in school, and you would rub the tape at the bottom with chalk. And then when it got in the water, it would wash the chalk off. So it was a lot easier to tell where the water level was, just kind of like on a dipstick where it's kind of hard to tell where the oil is sometimes. So that's the way it used to be, and it was kind of a hassle, and you had to go out to the well and measure it every time you wanted to get a number. So in modern times, we've upgraded to this thing that's called an E-tape, and instead of it being a steel rigid tape, it's now a plastic tape. But if I zoom in on this tape, you can see there's these two bumpy things on the edge, and what those are is two wires. And so when you lower this thing into the well, and this point hits the water, it bridges the contact between the two wires, and there's a little buzzer up on top that beeps. So you just lower it down into the well until it beeps, and then you know that's what the water level is, and you read the reading off of the tape. So that's the modern version of the steel tape, which is used to get a single point water level measurement these days. Cool. That works pretty good too, but you got to go out to the well and put it down the well every time you want to measure it. So now in digital days, we have these things called level loggers, or sometimes called data loggers. And like Kyle said, those are about the size of a big Cuban cigar. And what those do is they can record the water level or the depth of water above the logger, and they can store that information. And then you can come out periodically, take those things out of the well, grab the data off them, and you get a bunch of measurements instead of just getting one measurement at a time. So if you want to get a measurement every day or every minute or every second, you can set these correctly to store the information at those intervals and then come back later and collect the information. So it makes it a lot easier to get really high quality data. So how do these level loggers work? Kyle talked a little bit about it. It's kind of like having a scale. And so the pressure transducer is effectively a scale. And what it's doing is it's weighing how much water is over the top of it. So if there's a bunch of water sitting over the top of the logger, that means the water level's high. And so the scale is going to read high. If there's not so much water, then the scale is going to read low. And so what it does is it reads how much pressure or how much weight is above it, and then it converts that into feet of water and stores that information so that when you download it, you'll know how many feet of water are sitting over the top of that data logger. Okay, so what's inside the guts of this? Hopefully Kyle was going to be able to cut one of those apart. I did that many years ago, and it was a real challenge. So I'm kind of glad Kyle didn't try to do that because I almost lost a finger trying to do it.
Can you bring it to the meeting and we could do it together? Yeah. Oh, yeah, I'll bring an axe.
So what's inside one of these? Well, there's the pressure transducer. So that's the scale. That's down at the right-hand end here. You can kind of see in through here. It's right in there. And then there's a circuit board, of course, because it's digital and it records things. And on the circuit board, there's a clock and there's storage. So you can set the clock to go out and grab the number off of the scale and store it in the chip. And then when it's all powered well with a battery, and this is the reason that we worry about how long the data loggers have been in the well, because the battery will go dead after a while. There are loggers you can buy with replaceable batteries, and ecology uses some of those. We, PBAC, decided not to do that because we didn't want to mess with being out in the field in the cold, trying to change batteries out, and then wondering whether or not the battery put in was good and how long it was going to last. So we buy basically disposable loggers, and the batteries are getting pretty reliable to the point where they can last like 10 years when you record things at 1 hour increments. So that's kind of what's inside of one of these loggers.
And we do record at 1 hour increments, Steve?
Yeah, right now we do. When we do some kinds of research, they have to set them for really fine increments because we need a lot more data when we do things like pump testing. And sometimes they'll set them for 1 second intervals or 1 minute intervals. I'm not sure how long the new loggers, or how many data points the new loggers will store. But, 10 years ago, they would store like 10,000 points, and then it got to be 20,000, and now it's maybe 40 or 60,000. So as time goes on, they can store more information, and we can leave the loggers in the well longer before we have to download.
Sure.
So what's the procedure? Kyle goes out to the wells, each one of the wells, and he pulls the logger out of the well. The logger's hanging down in the well off of this end right here, maybe off of a rope or a steel cable, or even in some cases, fishing line, strong fishing line.
How long does that take, Kyle? Pull it out.
It depends, but
A while?
some of them are deployed like 200-300 feet.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a shoulder exercise.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Steve.
That's okay. So you pull the logger out of the well, you unscrew the left-hand side, you can see where this seam is, that cap comes off, and then there's a special connector you can put on that connects it to the computer. You can download the data off the logger. Then at the same time, you've got your manual measurement, and that's the way you convert what the logger's telling you to what that really means in terms of elevation above sea level. So the water level meter will tell you how far you are below the surface, and the logger will tell you how much water's above the logger. And with those two numbers, you can come up with what the elevation above sea level the logger's at. And that way you can compare different wells using that sea level elevation as opposed to just what the logger's reading. And then you reset and you put the logger back into the well and you move on to the next well. So that's the procedure, in addition to all the little trivial details that Kyle is really well versed in that are involved in each one of the wells, like horses and wasps and sometimes gates and locks and all kinds of different things you have to maneuver to get all these data. Okay, this is kind of a side thing, but in order to figure out or to understand what's going on when you measure the water levels, you kind of have to understand how a pumping well works. And the analogy that I like to use is this one right here, where you think of the aquifer as like being a really thick milkshake. And then the pump that's down in your well is right up here. And so what the pump is doing is it's pulling water out of the aquifer, or pulling milkshake out of that straw, out of the bottom of the milkshake. And for anybody, of course, everybody, I'm sure, has pulled on a good sturdy straw in a milkshake, and what you see is you see a dent where the straw is. It makes a dent, and eventually that dent will fill in. But as soon as you suck on the straw, you see a dent on the top of the aquifer. So when you go back to the well analogy of this, when you pull water out of the aquifer in the well, it basically makes a dent in the aquifer, and water that's close to that dent falls in to fill in that hole. And then the water that's close to the water that just fell in to fill the hole falls into that area. And as you work your way out, you're getting a bigger and bigger circle as you go around. So there's not as much depth of water needed to fill in the gap of the water inside of you. And you can see that it kind of tails off to when you get out past what's called the area of influence, you can't really even tell that that well is pumping. So on the Palouse, if you're maybe 20 miles away from one of the big wells in Pullman or Moscow or Palouse, you might not even realize that those wells are pumping. But if you're 100 feet away from one of those wells, the water level might go down almost instantly, 10, 15, 20 feet. So it depends on how close you are to the pumping well, what kind of water level response you get. And that's what some of the pumping tests do, is they listen to the aquifer, they monitor the water level in the aquifer. And if one pump turns on and at some point in time soon after, you see the water level go down, that's an indication that both of those wells are hydrologically connected. And so that's kind of what pump testing is about. Okay, well, that works good for one well. What happens if you got two people sucking off the milkshake? Okay, each straw acts like a single well, and out at the edge of each of the straws, you can't really tell the difference. But when you're in between the straws, the wells actually interfere with each other. So you kind of get double the decline in the water level in between these two wells. So the net effect on the aquifer is you get these bumps. So where the wells are separated, you'll have bumps. And if a well turns on or turns off, these bumps come up and down and they kind of undulate. And that's what's going on with the surface of the aquifer when we're pumping the aquifer system. So what happens when you're on the Palouse and you've got a whole bunch of wells? You know, you've got a bunch of them in Pullman, and you got a bunch at WSU and UI and Moscow and City Palouse, and you've got a bunch in the upper aquifer that we monitor too. Well, it becomes really hard to take a one-time measurement of the aquifer and determine what that means. So you need a longer term record of what's going on with the water levels to get a better feel for what's going on in the aquifer. Okay, so this is the map that I used this year for the monitoring wells. And this map only has 29 of the 34 on it. Some of the aquifers or the wells are really close to each other, so it would be redundant to have both of them on the map. And every once in a while, one of the wells doesn't give us quality data, or we don't have a long enough term record for that data. But each one of these cross-haired circles has a number next to it. And the blue ones are the lower aquifer wells, and the red ones are upper aquifer wells. So you can find a well, this is an upper aquifer well number 29, and you can go up to this map key and you can find out what well that is. And each well is associated with a hydrograph for that well. And that's what the map looks like. So for each one of the 29 locations on the map, there's a hydrograph on this map where you can quickly go and see how the water levels have been behaving over the period of record that we've been recording. So when you look over the entire aquifer and you look at the blue wells, all the blue wells seem to kind of be similar. You see that kind of steady decline in the water levels. And those are the lower aquifer water levels. And one of the reasons we know that these wells are all connected to each other is they all behave kind of the same way. They all have that constant rate of decline, and it's basically the same rate of decline over time. So that helps us believe that those are all connected hydrologically. The red wells, they're kind of all across the board. You see some red wells that are pretty steady over time in terms of a trend. You see other wells that go down for a while and then they come back up. And then you see wells that you don't really know what's going on. And that's because the upper aquifer isn't really one aquifer. It's kind of a bunch of compartments that are separated in space, so that all upper aquifer wells don't behave the same. So I picked out a couple of the wells on this map to look at the hydrographs. In the lower aquifer, I picked this well, which is the DOE Pullman test well. And that's kind of halfway between Pullman and Moscow, right next to Motley and Motley off of Sunshine Road, down there in the banks of Paradise Creek. And if you drive by there and you see this big, tall, 6-foot-high standpipe sticking out of the ground, and you ever wondered what that was, that's this monitoring well. So we've been monitoring this well with data loggers since the late 90s, but we've had pretty good high-quality data since 2006. So for quite a while, we've had high-quality data. And what each one of these hydrographs have is they have 3 different curves on them. They have, since every day the logger records one reading every hour, we can't graph all the hours of data on one graph. So what I do is I average things out by the day, and I make a chart of the average reading for each day, another curve for the maximum reading each day, and one for the minimum reading. So that's what those 3 curves are. And you can see they're not the same, but they're close to each other in this well. But what is showing up here is what Kyle talked about, which is the atmospheric pressure effect, because the logger actually picks up the pressure of the air or the weight of the atmosphere above the logger. And so that's why the maximums and minimums are different, because during the course of the day, the pressure might change and the water level may go up or down as much as a half a foot, just based on the pressure of the atmosphere that's going over the top. each one of the green triangles is a well visit where the E-tape went down. And like this case, Kyle went out there and visited. He put that tape down probably 300 feet, measured the water level. A year before that, he measured the water level. And you can see pretty consistently for the last several years, or quite a few years, we've only been going out once a year to get this stuff because the logger's been storing up the information and then we pull it off once a year. Back when they were doing the pump testing, they had to go out a lot because they would fill up quickly because they were recording intervals of like 1 minute or 1 second. So that's why you'll see all these green triangles kind of bunched together when they were doing the aquifer tests. Now, in an individual year, what people like to do is they like to look at these and say, oh, well, it looks like we're discharging water here and we're recharging. So this must be recharge. This must be the discharge and this must be the recharge. Well, really, that's not so much the truth. What's actually happening, there might be recharge occurring throughout the year, but what's happening is this is where more straws start sucking harder on the milkshake. And so the cone that makes in the milkshake gets deeper, and the water levels that get measured then go down because they're measuring a cone that's getting deeper. And then once fewer wells are sucking on the milkshake, or they're not sucking quite as hard, that cone gets to relax, and that's called recovery. And that's what you see at the end of the pumping season. When the pumps kind of start to lay off, you can see the well starts to recover. Okay, but what happens when you're using the aquifer beyond its sustainable level is the well never recovers to the level that it was at the previous year. So effectively, you're taking water out of that aquifer that isn't being replaced by recharge. So when you see a water level hydrograph like this, what you can basically say is we're pumping out more than is being recharged. Right now, if you do the regression line from 2006 to this summer, you get about 0.7 of a foot a year. So that's how fast the water level's going down in the lower aquifer now, about 0.7 of a foot. And that's less than it used to go down. It used to go down at over a foot a year in the 1990s and early 2000s. But it's still continuing to go down, which means we're still continuing to pull more water out of the aquifer than it's being recharged. Okay, here's another lower aquifer well. This is in Palouse, the city of Palouse. And this one has wild looking yellow lines on it. And the Palouse well is in their city well. And so they have a pump in that well pulling on the water in the aquifer. So they have their own straw for the city inside of that well when we're monitoring it. So what these yellow lines are showing you is when they turn the pump on, the data logger recorded a value when the pump was on. And you can see that the water level was maybe 5, 6 feet lower when the pump was on than when the pump was off. And that's what's called the drawdown of the aquifer out there when you turn the pump on. So when you look at the hydrographs in this map and you see the hydrographs that have a bunch of yellow in them, you'll be able to say, oh, that well has a pump in it. It's not strictly a monitoring well, it's got a pump in it. So we're measuring not only the maximum level, which is that kind of cyan color, we're also measuring the minimum level in that well when the well's pumping. Okay, here's an upper aquifer well. This is at the old Moscow Police Department out on the sidewalk of the Moscow Police Department. So back in 2010, they were redoing the sidewalks in front of the police department, and they took the old side, ripped the old sidewalk off, and they discovered there was a well right underneath the sidewalk. And so it turns out there used to be a dairy there around the turn of the century, and the dairy used the well to water their cows, and progress came, sidewalks went over, dairies went away, but the well was still there. And so we put a logger in that well, and we've been monitoring it ever since. And you can see what's been going on in that well. This is kind of a crazy well, but this is measuring what's going on at the police department in the upper aquifer. So year to year, it would kind of go up and go down, but have a little bit of an overall decline year to year until 2007. And then something happened in 2007, and you see the upper aquifer starts to go like this. So not only is it recovering, it looks like it's past where it was before, so it must be recharging. So this upper aquifer by the police department must be recharging. That's what that hydrograph is telling us. And if you wonder why that might be, you can look at the pumping in the upper aquifer by the city of Moscow. And sure enough, from the years up to about 2017, Moscow pulled on average 30% of their water out of the upper aquifer. But starting in 2017 and especially in 2018, they curtailed the amount of pumping that they do out of the upper aquifer, and now they don't pump hardly any water out of the upper aquifer. So when they cut back on the pumping of the upper aquifer, then the recharge was able to overpower any other pumping in the upper aquifer, and the upper aquifer is recharging and going back to the levels that it used to be at before it was pumped. So that's how you see water level recharge in the aquifer.
Steve, as a side note, we'll get some really interesting data this next year. We've had well 6 down as we build a new pump house. And so we've been pumping the upper aquifer. And so it'll be really interesting to start to, our goal is to dial in and find that sustainable pumping level for that upper aquifer. And as we replace the filtration system, it is a lot higher in iron and manganese, but we should get some really good data in this next year on the impact of that increased pumping this year.
Yeah, okay, Kyle, that'll be good. One of the things you need to keep in mind is it's really great to have the upper aquifer recovering from that pumping. But what happens is when Moscow isn't pumping from the upper aquifer, they still need that amount of water. And so what they've done to compensate for not pumping out of the upper aquifer is they've been pumping out of the lower aquifer. So effectively, they're putting more pressure on the lower aquifer by curtailing the upper aquifer. And what we're shooting for is both aquifers to be sustainable. And that's part of what the alternative water supply project is about, is trying to come up with a supplemental supply that'll allow us to back off of our upper and lower aquifers and let them hit a sustainable level. So this saving water in one aquifer and using it in the other is this robbing Peter to pay Paul thing. So there isn't any free water that we know about the aquifer that we can tap, at least a lot of water, let's say. Okay, so why do I care? You care because if you're a member of PBAC and you represent one of the entities, your entity agreed to abide by this wonderful thing called the Groundwater Management Plan that was enacted in September of 1992, where all the entities agreed to comply with what's inside the plan. And there's a bunch of stuff inside the plan, but I'm going to show you some of the things that apply to water levels. So chapter 6 of that plan is about the roles of the committee, what the committee is supposed to be doing. And 6.2 said it's the responsibility of the committee to collect water level information as well as consumption information. So they agreed that they were going to collect this information for water levels and consumption. So what you're doing with these loggers and daily hydrographs and things like that is you're meeting your commitment to the water management plan to collect the information. 6.2.3 is about research, and they have some bullets for what type of research they wanted to support. Model studies to evaluate the effects of these management strategies that you're looking at. Most all of the models that we use these days require water levels and pumping as inputs. So if we don't have data to put into these models, we won't ever be able to develop models that effectively allow us to evaluate the alternatives. So we have to collect the information to make the models worthwhile. Field investigations to better determine geologic, not only, but hydrogeologic characteristics. And the water levels help us determine the hydrogeologic characteristics, like those hydrographs I showed you. This one's recharging, this one's not being pumped sustainably. Those type of hydrogeologic characteristics we get out of the water levels. And then this one applies to the alternative supply study. Conduct studies of incremental water supply sources. Now, the word I like to use, which sometimes gets mixed up with incremental and alternative, is supplemental, because the plan is to find a water supply that supplements the groundwater, but to continue to pump the groundwater, but instead of pumping it unsustainably, to pump it sustainably, so that we'll always be able to have groundwater accessible, but we'll be pumping it sustainably. So that's a supplemental source, is what we're looking for. Okay, why do I care again? This is what we thought, or we said the basin boundary was in 2005, all the way up until last year. And there were always some questions and some arguments about places like Colfax. Well, is Colfax really part of the basin or isn't it? is Palouse part of the basin or isn't it? And for years, I've been asking having Earl Bennett ask if Genesee is in the basin or not. And so over the years, based upon our water level monitoring and the other geologic and hydrogeologic research, we've pretty much been able to conclude that Colfax is not inside the basin. The water levels there don't go down with that steady decline like they do inside the Palouse Basin. And the rocks are much lower there than they are in the Palouse Basin. So the same layer of basalt might be 250 feet lower in Colfax in elevation than it is inside the Palouse Basin. So we've concluded Colfax isn't in the basin. We used to not know about Palouse, but based upon geologic and hydrogeologic data for Palouse, we've concluded that Palouse is inside the basin. And why does it matter whether you're inside or outside? Well, it matters because if what happens in Pullman impacts what's going on in Palouse, Palouse maybe should be involved in the conversation. And vice versa. If what goes on in Palouse impacts what's going on in Pullman, maybe Pullman should know about it. And so identifying which communities are actually inside or outside the basin becomes kind of important. When I take the two lower aquifer hydrographs that I showed you before, the well outside of Motley and Motley on Sunshine Road, and the one that's in the city of Palouse, and I overlay them on each other, I see this. Okay, and you can see that they both behave really closely. Now, Palouse, there's a pump in that well, and so it pumps for their park and their swimming pool and their cemetery and all that. Palouse does behave a little bit differently than the Motley and Motley well. But over the long term, since we've been collecting this data, it's a pretty safe bet to assume that these are the same aquifer system. Because if Palouse and Motley were in different aquifers and we're pumping all this water out of Moscow and Pullman and only a little bit of water out of Palouse, we wouldn't see curves that look the same like this. So this is pretty strong evidence that they're in the same aquifer system. So the new boundary, which is now out and adopted by the committee last year, is a 2023 boundary. And you can see we've gotten rid of Colfax because they're not part of the basin. And we've included Palouse because we're pretty sure they're in the basin now. But we still don't know about Genesee.